Hello, my name is Ian Scott, and I am the founder of Scott Legal. And today we are here to talk about new business entity selection and really looking at the different types of business entities, in particular, three types of business entities, and looking at the advantages and disadvantages of those different entity types. In terms of my own background, I am a CPA and also a lawyer, and spent a number of years working as a business lawyer and also working in an investment bank on different types of financial transactions. So very, very familiar with different types of business entities. And also because of the CPA background, do have a little bit of background on tax. I'm definitely not a tax attorney, but sometimes when we're looking at setting up these business entities, we are looking at taking into account tax considerations as well. We often do, when we work on when we do business entity setup work, we often do refer out the tax matters, but again, I have a basic tax knowledge because of the CPA. And then finally, I have an MBA as well. So really kind of, in terms of educational and work experience background, really quite familiar with these different types of entities. So in terms of a few housekeeping items, a few things that we will send to you after the webinar, we will send you this chart that I'm going to go through. It is a PDF document that summarizes a lot of what we are going to talk about, and we actually are going to use it as a guide. This webinar is actually being recorded, so we will send you the recording after the webinar as well, and we will also send you this recording, which is a link to our YouTube channel, where we have a number of different webinars and or other topics on our YouTube channel. So we do encourage you to subscribe to the YouTube channel, because other business related topics, and also our firm specializes in immigration as well. We have a combination of business and immigration work. So you can also find a number of different immigration videos and webinars on there as well. In terms of questions and answers, if you do have questions and answers during the presentation, you can either put those in the Q&A box or the chat box. We will get to all questions and answers during the presentation. And also, what we're going to send you, if you need additional information on entity setup or any other of the services that we offer, we are also going to send you a link where you can set up a consultation to do that. So without further ado, we will jump right in, and you can see on the screen, we're going to kind of go through these in question answer format. So, who is this entity perfect for? And we have three different types of entities listed there. So really, there are other entity types that exist, but for the purposes of this presentation, we are going to focus on corporation and LLC, which is a limited liability company, or sole proprietorship. So before we get into the actual questions, let me just describe what these entities really are, and in terms of what their purpose is and what they're for. So let's start with the sole proprietorship. So we'll move right along to the right first. Now, a sole proprietorship, that might be what one calls a mom and pop shop, right? So, and what that is really getting at, it's really geared towards someone who wants to set up a very, very small business and really doesn't want any of the administrative or compliance requirements related to setting up very much. So they might just go and register the business at their with the local department, and really go about their activities as with little administrative or compliance burden associated with it. But really, with that, it is individual as well, as the name implies, sole proprietorship, meaning solo. So that's really what we're looking at there, and it really would be for someone who wants to start something small and wants to keep it individual, because the minute it kind of moved to two people, then we would be looking at a different entity type, like an LLC or a partnership. We're not going to get into partnership entity types today, but you would be looking at a different entity type if there were to be more than one person. Now we move to the next one or actually we're going to move to the far left, and we're going to talk about a corporation. Now, when you set up a sole proprietorship, one of the big issues with the sole proprietorship is the there's no separation between the business and yourself. So in some cases, a sole proprietorship might just be an entity that where someone is at their house and they're saying, I'm going to offer these particular services. Let's say they set up a lemonade stand outside of their house and set up particular services. But let's say someone comes to the lemonade stand and they trip and fall on your property, and or they drink your lemonade and they get really sick. Then in a sole proprietorship, if they were going to sue someone, they would sue you. There's no separation between the entity and you. So if there's a problem, if there's a dispute, the debt dispute, or there was a lease that was signed, or someone was suing you because they were injured, that they're going to sue you. Now, because of one of the main reasons that these other types of entities were started, corporation and LLC, was because of that reason, because we wanted to be able to separate the individual from the company. So then what was born was this idea of a corporation. So a corporation is a completely separate and distinct legal entity. So in those examples that I mentioned, if you set up a lemonade stand and you'd set up a corporation and someone came and drank your lemonade and they realized they were allergic and got very sick and thought it was your fault because you didn't have disclaimers or waivers on your before people drank your lemonade, then in that case, they can't, if you have a corporation set up and you're acting in the name of the corporation, then the only person that they could, or the only entity that they could sue, is the actual corporation. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because if they're suing you, that means if your business doesn't have money, then where do they go next? They go to your house, your car, or other property that you have. So you're going to be personally liable to pay for whatever judgment that is made against you. But with a corporation, if that example where someone drinks some lemonade and has an allergic reaction, then the individual is only going to be able to sue the corporation. And if the corporation doesn't have any assets, or the corporation runs out of assets, then it ends there. They can't just turn around then and sue you just because you own the corporation, right? So this, what that is called, it's called limited liability protection. So your liability is limited. Your personal liability is limited to the assets in the corporation, right? So that's a really good reason for deciding to set up a corporation rather than a sole proprietorship. And the first thing that might come to your mind is, well, very low risk of me getting sued. But, so what, right? A corporation doesn't cost that much to set up, and we'll see LLC even less, that you could be sued. And why open yourself up to the risk of having unlimited liability when you don't have to, right? So that is a corporation. Now, the one thing with a corporation, though, is that when corporations, when the idea of corporations came along a long time ago, they were viewed as complicated, because if it's a separate legal entity, then you need a separate tax return for it. And it's not a personal tax return, it's a corporate tax return. So it could be more expensive to have someone do that. It's a much more complicated tax return than a personal tax return. Then also, in order to be able to adhere to what the law says with respect to corporations, there are a certain number of corporate formalities that you must follow if you set up a corporation. So you have to have a meeting where you elect a board. You have to elect officers of the company. You have to issue shares. All of this has to be documented, and this is the case even if you're the sole member of the corporation, right? So this is the case even if it's just you. You might have a meeting with yourself where you appoint yourself as president and board member, then assign all the shares to yourself and things like that. But it is important to go through those formalities, and some people found them complicated, and that's why some people shied away from corporations. And as a result of that, lo and behold, what was created were LLCs, limited liability companies. Now, the great thing about LLCs is that they have the same limited liability protections that corporations have. So if you are operating in the name of the LLC and someone sues you, or this LLC signs an agreement an entity for a lease or something like that, then it is treated as an entity for the purposes of that, and that's beneficial for the reasons that I just described. Now, the difference though is that the LLC doesn't have the corporate formalities that we just talked about. Instead, with an LLC, you can just have a fairly simple operating agreement. If it's a single member LLC, you may even download that from the internet or get a simple operating agreement from a different source and utilize that as your operating agreement. But the corporate formalities really aren't there, and that's why a lot of people have moved towards setting up LLCs instead of corporations. The other thing with LLCs, when you are a single member LLC or in some other circumstances, you can instead of having a separate corporate tax return, they're treated in some cases as what are called disregarded entities for tax, which just simplifies the process because you can just take the earnings of the LLC and then apply those earnings to your actual personal tax return. So it's a much simpler way to prepare a tax return. So sometimes the ongoing cost associated with the preparation of the tax returns or the tax piece of your business is going to be significantly less if you do an LLC. Now, when you're deciding between an LLC and a corporation, as we said, they're both limited liability entities, and this sometimes is where tax planning strategies might come into play. And you'd work with a tax advisor to see if, based on the activity that you plan in the future for your business, is a corporation better than an LLC. So, for example, when I started my entity, Scott Legal PC, so you'll see it's a professional corporation. We're going to talk about why there's a P in front of them there instead of just Inc. or incorporated. But when I started, I did go back and forth with respect to whether or not I should set up a corporation or an LLC. But because I felt that I would ultimately hire more employees, and we have 12 full-time staff now, then there were, and I think still are, a few more tax planning opportunities that are found with a corporation, even though I do have a separate accountant, a great accountant who does the corporate tax return as well as my personal tax return. But I think there are a few more tax planning opportunities that are available with a corporation. But I think it really does depend on your situation. I think it's good to have both a business person and a tax person talking about whether or not which entity type is best for you. So, for example, if someone's starting an entity and they plan on perhaps raising capital in the future, then raising capital like selling shares or something to other people in the future, then that might be something that would be better suited to a corporation. Whereas if you were just entering into more of a partnership, which is with smaller business with two people, or some type of consulting arrangement, then it might be that an LLC might be sufficient for the purposes of that. The only other thing to comment on with LLCs is that there are some states, like for example, New York, that does require what's called a publication requirement for an LLC. And really what it is that I have no idea why this is still in the law, but what it is they require the LLC to publish in these local newspapers in different places saying that this LLC is opening. And sometimes it can be quite costly. It can be, upwards of $1,000, depending on which county in New York you are in, that you have to pay out just to really, for something that's just a law that's been on the books for a long time, that doesn't really serve a really great purpose. So yeah, so let us move then to, and we see in this slide or in this who is the entity perfect for corporation. Sometimes when we look at corporations, it can be multiple business owners. You can have one business owner as well. When I started my corporation, it was one, but a lot of the time you see more business owners, and they don't mind complying with the administrative formalities, and as a result of that, they are maybe a little bit more sophisticated than the average investor or person setting up a company, or they have counsel that is assisting them through that process. For an LLC, it can be an individual, can be multiple owners as well. And, and we're going to get into some of the other kind of reasons why LLC can pop up as a good entity. We mentioned in this area S corporation, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But sometimes an LLC will give you the advantages that filing for S status for a corporation will give you, and then sole proprietorships, they're really for, very limited compliance, but, you're open to the risk of being sued. However, generally, those are going to be for much smaller businesses. In terms of number of owners, all of these can be kind of one or more. In terms of if the sole proprietorship was the or more, then it would be two different people just not registering a business, each of which has kind of a sole proprietorship. So each of them has their independent business. So it's not kind of a joint business. It's just for the purposes of the business, they're both completely independent. And then the only other thing to keep in mind is, and we may as well talk about this now, is the idea of an S corporation or S election, right? Now let's this is a bit complicated, so let's describe it in a little bit of detail. I'm just going to close this door. Let's describe it in a bit of detail. So when you have a corporation set up, then the corporation, as I said, it's a separate legal entity. So that means it's taxed separately. So let's say, for example, someone, just keep the numbers, kind of even or simpler numbers. Let's say a corporation takes in revenue of $100,000 and then has expenses of $50,000. Now there's $50,000 left. So if there's a corporation, that corporation is going to be taxed. They're going to be taxed based on the corporate tax rate, and there could be a corporate tax rate which is federal, which is maybe 21%, and then it could be a corporate tax rate that is state. So New York has a corporate tax rate as well. So then after that's taxed, the money that is in that particular entity gets paid out to the owners in dividends or distributions, or some could come, through salary, but dividends and distributions. Now then the owners pay tax on it again. And so what is happening there is it's really a system of what we call double taxation, right? And no one likes double taxation, especially if you're a small business where, you have a corporate entity and you pay tax at the corporate level, and then now you're also paying a high tax rate, personal tax rate at the personal level. So what the government allows you to do, what the IRS allows you to do, is for certain types of corporations, and there are restrictions. So certain types of corporations, you're allowed to file what is called an S as in Sam election, right? So people call things S corporations, but there's no S corporation. All corporations are just corporations, but some of those corporations actually just file for what is this S status. And what that S status allows you to do is have the entity treated as a pass-through entity. So there's no double taxation. So in the example that I used, where the company makes $100,000 and there's $50,000 in profit, instead of applying the corporate tax rate to that $50,000, the $50,000 would just pass right through to the owners, and then the owners would pay a tax rate on the $50,000. So it eliminates the idea of double taxation. Now, just as I think, because it's a good segue into an LLC, that's one of the reasons sometimes people go to an LLC right away, because for a single member LLC and for some partnerships, you get that exact treatment without doing anything, without filing for an S election or without doing anything, because the LLC can be treated as a pass-through entity without actually doing anything. And now the other thing to keep in mind is, and this is another reason sometimes people go to LLCs, is because the LLC, in order to elect for S status, you have to meet certain requirements. So we saw here, one of the requirements is that if you're a corporation, there can only be a maximum of 100 owners. And also, if you're applying for S status, then all of the owners, every single one of the owners has to be a resident for tax purposes. Now, one of the things that you have to keep in mind here, and it's something that a lot of people get wrong, even CPAs and different things like that get wrong. The S election is not something that is reserved for people who have a green card or who are US citizens. It is reserved for people who are residents for tax purposes in the United States. And there are lots of ways that people can be residents for tax purposes. So for example, you can become a resident for tax purposes just by spending 183 days in the United States. So in a particular year, in a calendar year. So what happens here is sometimes people have visas, and we, as I said, we do immigration. So we have a lot of people with visas, and they come to us, oh, I can't file this for this S status because I'm not a citizen. I'm not a green card holder. And my accountant told me this, and it's absolutely incorrect because, they will, as soon as they meet the tests for residency, or if they will meet the test for residency, they can apply for an S election, and the entity could be treated as a pass-through entity. And if not, you can move to setting up an LLC, setting up an LLC instead. And then for sole proprietorships, there's no kind of restriction on who can own. The other thing to kind of keep in mind is, and again, because we deal with a lot of foreign nationals, is that unlike other countries in the world, the United States does not have restrictions with respect to foreign nationals owning corporations, LLCs, or sole proprietorships. So someone could be in a country, in your home country that isn't United States, and they could set up a corporation, set up an LLC, and without any issue, they can own it, and there's no, there's no issue with that. With a lot of other countries, that's not the case. You need a tax ID for the individual. It's very complicated. The other thing to keep in mind is that because we do have a lot of kind of international people in the webinar, and our firm deals with a lot of international people, setting up an entity in the United States is very straightforward. We set up an entity in Spain, and it was very complicated. We had to fund the bank account. We had to submit something to the government. We had to wait a period of time before then after that was done, you had to get a notary, which you had to pay over $1,000 to notarize, and all of these things you had to do to set up a company. It took months to do. Whereas in the United States, you can set up a company in many jurisdictions and immediately. Sometimes you can do it immediately online. And then almost all or most jurisdictions have ways to set up entities where you can pay a small fee to have the process expedited within a day or a few days. But definitely interesting to keep in mind, because the system here is very different from many other countries. Most jurisdictions are trying to make it easy for people to set up entities, because they can obviously get tax revenues if an entity has been set up in their jurisdiction. Recently, we saw that the state of California is actually not even charging people the filing fees for setting up an entity. So that's something to keep in mind. So very, very important distinction when we look at S corporations, S status for corporations, because it comes up a lot, and you definitely can be eligible as long as you're a resident for tax purposes. Now let's look at the advantages, of the different entity types. So a lot of the time when we set up entities for individuals, we send them a questionnaire and we ask them about their goals so that we can advise them as to whether or not they should set up a corporation or an LLC. Because we're almost never going to advise setting up a sole proprietorship. But for a sole proprietorship, the advantage is that it's inexpensive to form, and there are few administrative duties associated with it, right? But obviously the advantage of either a corporation or an LLC is going to be the limited liability protection. That's definitely one that's going to be big. Now, for a corporation, a lot of the time we'll move to a corporation if the individual is thinking of raising capital in the United States, because the reason is that even though one of the things to keep in mind, if you have a corporation, the ownership units are called shares, right? So everyone knows what a share is. But with an LLC, the ownership units are called membership units, right? So a lot of the time, if you're raising capital in the market and you call something a membership unit, people aren't going to know what that is. And maybe they're not going to give you their money, because there's like, well, is this the same as a share? And I know what a common share or a preferred share is, but I don't know what a membership unit is. So a lot of the time, even when angel investors and venture capital funds are investing in particular entities, if they're set up as LLCs, they will convert them to corporations before actually investing. So that's kind of one advantage of setting up a corporation. And as I said, it might be that there might be some tax advantages associated with a corporation also. So those are advantages that you'd have to sit down with a tax advisor to look at. The disadvantages of a corporation is, you do have to file the S election, and it is restricted, right? Like you may not be able to do it based on your residency or other reasons. And the LLC, there's not anything to do with respect to making the entity a pass-through entity right from the beginning. And then, of course, the disadvantages are administrative duties for a corporation, and the restrictions. So they're just really the converse of what we talked about just now. And we talked about as well the publication requirement in some jurisdictions. New York's a big one because the cost to publish in these particular entities or can be significant, right? The other thing with the limited liability entities, when the owner dies, there's still something left in terms of the shares or the membership units have value, can have value, and can be passed on to other people. If it's a sole proprietorship and the person passes away, there is no, the business dissolves upon the death of the owner. So that's something that you might consider for tax planning purposes or state planning purposes as well. When we look at the cost to set these different things up, we see that corporation can be moderate, and really it's going to be different by state, right? But usually, setting up an entity in the United States, to set up a corporation or an LLC, it's going to be between the $200 to $400 mark, and that would include whatever fees that you're going to have to pay for expediting as well. So most states will provide expedite for relatively low fee. And then we have sole proprietorship. That's always going to be very, very low startup costs, because you can do nothing and have a sole proprietorship in terms of not registered anywhere and have a sole proprietorship, because the default is that if you have a business and you haven't registered it anywhere, then the default is that you have a sole proprietorship. So that's and in terms of the difficulty to set up, that's it's definitely going to be the most difficult is going to be the corporation, because you have to you really do have to do things like appoint the board, create bylaws for the corporation. If you don't do things like that, then what can happen is there's a concept in the law called piercing the corporate veil, and it's the one time when if someone sues you, they can actually go through the corporation and sue you personally. So in order to avoid that, what you have to do is make sure that you're complying with corporate formalities. And we have a great article on our website related to the corporate formalities that you're required to follow in order to comply with the corporation. And then LLC, we talked about the only requirement is that you have an operating agreement, and that operating agreement can be quite simple, especially if you are a single member. If you do have multiple owners in the LLC, because you can have multiple people, then the operating agreement becomes more complex, because the operating agreement is the document that's going to be used to kind of define what is going on in the entity, like who gets paid, who can make management decisions, et cetera. So it would be important that that document is properly drafted, and it's going to take into account what happens in the event of a what happens in the event of a dispute. What's going to happen. We talked about this already in terms of what happens if someone is trying to sue you, if if your corporation or an LLC, no problem. But definitely don't underestimate the issues associated with being sued if you're a sole proprietorship, because as I said, some things could come up that you may not expect. In the United States, it's a country where it's a very litigious environment, so people sue here where in other countries they don't. But we're here, people sue for everything, right? So so to the extent that they can sue and have maybe the basis of getting your house or your car or your firstborn or whatever, they will do it, right? So it's good to have the liability limited, so that you're not able to they're not able to come after you. So we talked about taxation a little bit. If you with a corporation, unless you elect for S status, then and the election's free, the IRS lets you file a form, and you just have to file it by a certain time. Even if you file it late, sometimes you can file and say, I didn't have proper counsel, and that was the reason, etc. And they're quite good with that. But then the other restrictions to avoid double taxation And then LLCs don't have double taxation as long as you, because in LLC because all of these, what I'm going over is the basic, right? In LLC, there are things you can do to have an LLC and then elect for corporate status. But I'm always talking about the kind of default treatment of an LLC, which is going to be a disregarded entity for tax purposes and a flow pass-through entity. And then, all of these, when we talk about S election, really what we're talking about is just can you make it so that you're not double taxed? But regardless of, there a few things you can be certain on in life, and one is death and the other is taxes, right? So all of the entity types, you're going to have to pay taxes. And then with respect to self-employment tax, one of the key things with a corporation, and if you do elect for S status, you do have to pay yourself a reasonable salary. And what this talks about, it's talking about the self-employment taxes are like there are payroll taxes that are paid that if you have a distribution from your company, you don't have to pay those payroll taxes. So again, it has to do with tax planning opportunities. And I think the tax planning piece is definitely beyond the scope of this, but definitely when you're looking at again, whether, and maybe the point of this particular slide is when you're looking at whether or not to set up a corporation or an LLC, it's a good idea to have a conversation with a tax advisor to make sure that you are fully understanding what the possible tax planning opportunities are that are available to you. The other thing to consider for the professionals out there, so lawyers, et cetera, is that most entities in the United States don't just allow, a person to set up an entity. So you saw in our name, we're Scott Legal PC, so it's Scott Legal Professional Corporation. Now, we have to go through a special process where we have to go to kind of the regulators of people who regulate lawyers for the state and show them that we're licensed to practice in that particular state. So this, a professional corporation or a PLLC, a professional limited liability company, are things that you have to, have to go through additional hoops. And what they tend to try and do, like, for example, for lawyers, what they're really getting at is that if a lawyer doesn't have a or if the lawyer has a limited liability company, then they're protected except for malpractice. So what the law says is that it's a professional corporation, so if someone sues you for malpractice, you should have malpractice insurance, or the people can come after your personal assets, right? So it's very important in the United States to have malpractice insurance if you're a lawyer, because even if you have a corporation, you can't just hide behind the corporation. So that's and they want to make sure that everyone who's setting up a professional corporation and holding themselves out as professionals, that they actually do meet the requirements of that particular body. And that is in a nutshell the kind of an overview of these different types of entities and the advantages and the disadvantages and some of the tax considerations associated with them. Again, we will send you a copy of this PDF document. We will send you a copy of the presentation. We'll send you a link where you can set up a consultation. A lot of people set up these entities. As I said, we do a lot of investor visas. So a lot of people set up these entities, and we help people set up these entities so that they can get these investor visas. But we also help clients within the United States that are or outside of the United States who want to just set up a business entity and work with them through some of these issues to navigate what's the best type of entity for them to set up. And again, my name is Ian Scott, and our firm is Scott Legal. And definitely reach out if you need anything from us. And I am looking at the questions. I don't see any questions that people have asked. So unless something comes in the next minute or two, we will call it a day. Okay, well, thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.